Hi, welcome back to the 1619 Project, show number 4. My name is Antonio Ruiz, and with me is my partner, Thomas Fields.
Hello.
Who doesn't
How
have
you
to
doing,
say his
Antonio?
name? Who doesn't have to say his name? I'll say it for him.
Okay.
Thomas, before we start on that, we're going to deal with the sugar chapter, just chapter 3. I do have to mention this book that I've been reading in my ethnic literature class. God, what a terrible name for a class. It's called The Marrow of Tradition. You can read it. You can't read it. I don't know why you can't read it.
Got your background. I think
my
when you
background.
put it in front of your face.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can read it. Yeah. Okay. Up. Well, it was there
all
for
right,
a while.
whatever. It's called The Marrow of Tradition. And it's a really interesting book. It's actually, this is the Bedford Cultural Edition. So there's a bunch of essays, historical and cultural context. What's interesting about this book is it's written, it was published actually in 1901. The writer is Black, Charles W. Chestnut. As we used to say when I was working at Howard, very high yellow Black man, but who wrote a book and actually published by a major New York publisher, Houghton Mifflin. And it's fictional, but it's based on an event, 1889, where in Wilmington, North Carolina, just after Election Day on November 10th, 1898, there was basically an armed insurrection by a white mob, some of them, including prominent citizens, premeditated, organized an attack on the city's over 11,000 Black residents. There's no real accounting as to how many people were killed. I mean, the range is from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand. And it was because they wanted to take over the government, the local government, because there was a number of Black political leaders who were elected to the different offices. And what, about halfway through the book, and what was interesting as I'm reading it, is that you could literally take this story and bring it to the year 2022. And that's sad.
Yeah. I've done a little reading on this in Wilmington, North Carolina. And what's interesting is this happened to be a city government that was both Black and white. It was Black. And that was what I think was really threatening. And to my thinking, this was a coup d'etat.
Well, it was, yeah.
They came in and they basically shot the elected officials. And the officials had requested help from the federal government. And of course, none came. The saddest part of all is that after this government was overthrown, no help came, then it was erased from the history books. And that's really sad.
Did it upset some young white boys?
Yeah, of course. It certainly upsets them today to read about it, making them, feeling bad about themselves. There's young students, so yeah.
Let's move on to 1619, something more depressing. The opening of this book chapter is really interesting because I didn't realize a lot of this. I mean, I knew about sugar and the role of sugar because you always hear about the role of cotton. You don't really hear about the role of tobacco. Definitely don't hear about I think what most of us, when we grew up growing up, we heard about sugar, we thought about sugar like, sugar cane in Cuba or Puerto Rico or somewhere in the Caribbean never thought of sugar here in the United States. But for a long time, sugar was a very large cash crop.
Yeah.
I mean, think about, not more than, well, maybe, yeah, I would say more than cotton. Everybody uses sugar all over the world. So it opens up with a description. I can't ever use the word plantation ever again. now that I know forced labor camp.
Yes.
Trying to get used to saying that because I never, you don't think about that. Plantation is a nice, plantation with a big house and
plantation rum. It's like a drink.
Yeah. On the banks of the Mississippi River, it talks about this plantation, forced labor camp called the Whitney Plantation. And it's at the northern edge of St. John the Baptist Parish. And, this would be a parish. Wouldn't this be in
Louisiana?
Louisiana, right.
Yeah.
But Mississippi River obviously goes through Louisiana. And it talks about this. And what's interesting is that it's also I guess you call it a tourist attraction, the story of slavery. And it goes on to talk about this place, Whitney. And it talks about before the European arrived, all of this land was home to, I'm mispronouncing the name, Tenza Indians. And Germans began showing up in 1719, after which the area was called the German Coast. The plantation was built, the Whitney Plantation, as it's known, was built in 1752. And it just goes on to talk about how the sugar the sugar crop, but even though cotton and tobacco dominated the colonial American economy, it was sugar that anchored the economy of the larger Atlantic world from the 16th century on. Sugar slavery, which was uniquely destructive and deadly, made Brazil the focal point in a triangular trade in the century before 20 to 30 Africans landed at Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. And then it just goes on to talk about, over the span of nearly 300 years from the mid-16th century on, a succession of European countries plied an international slave trade with African elites and dealers on one side of the ocean and an insatiable demand by white colonists for enslaved labor on the other. And, we haven't gotten to talk about the capitalism chapter, which is coming up. But, you have to look at all of this in the context of money, right? I mean,
yes, of course.
You want to maximize your profits. Well, one of the largest parts of costs, is labor in any industry. So if you can get away with paying low wages or no wages, even better. And as I've been going through this book, dealing with the capitalism, dealing with the sugar, dealing with the Marrow tradition, I'm almost like, you cannot talk about any of this. You can't talk about American history without talking about the role of labor, the role of capitalism, the idea that why would you buy land when you can steal it? Why, or force people to hand over their land? I think this is like, for me, having a bigger discussion about America and greed and capitalism is something that even to this day, I just don't think people, they have their jobs, you know, because I remember I used to consult small businesses. Everybody wants to be rich. And how they get there, they really haven't quite figured it out. But when you ask them about, well, have you included your labor costs in your business plan? Well, I figure I could just get away with minimum wage, which is, of course, I don't know, what is it? Well, now it's been raised, but at that time it was what, $7.25, $7.50?
Possibly something like that, yes.
So I just kind of throw that out as the bigger framework, the bigger context, this idea of the role of capitalism and the role of enslaved labor.
I don't think you can uncouple slavery from capitalism. Slavery is driven by capitalism. And as it was pointed out in this book, you had a triangle. The triangle started with the slaves coming from Africa to the New World, often to cultivate sugar. And the sugar was made into rum, which was sent back to the Old World. And as you stated correctly, slaves were at the base of that because they provided the labor. I would say, if you look at it from the slaveholder's point of view, the labor wasn't free. They had to pay for the transportation of human bodies. They had to pay for those that survived, feeding them, however sparingly. And they looked at it as being an investment, but it was certainly an investment that gave back a multitude far more than they put into it. And you can also look at it, the fact that when they raped women, or if the women had children, that was their investment paying off. Also, other things why it's important to talk about capitalism and coupling it with slavery is this. It leads you to the question of reparations. Because if slave labor was the fuel that drove capitalism in this country, which in fact helped this country propel to being a first world country, it was done on the backs of slaves who did not benefit from that system. Immigrants who came here with a foothold and who came here ahead of the slaves, enslaved people, they benefited from it. The people that were working, that managed the slave people in the fields, they benefited from it. Certainly those who owned those forced labor camps benefited from it. Even those who were in the North, who had factories that did not have slave labor, they benefited from it because they got cheap resources and cheap goods. So it's the backbone, economic backbone of this country. If that's the case, which it is, reparations are in order. And just one final word on that whole issue of reparations. I've had several people ask me, well, what about reparations? Why should Blacks have reparations? Why should any enslaved people have reparations in this country? I didn't own a slave. My forefathers didn't own a slave. And that's kind of easy to knock down. But the bigger question they often ask is, you're starting presidents. The presidents, no one has ever been paid reparations, which of course is not correct.
Not true.
Yeah, the Japanese were paid reparations. And in fact, over the issue of slavery, slave masters were paid reparations for their slaves. And that took place
after the Civil War.
Yeah, and it took place in 1762 while the Civil War was still going on.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah,
right.
But Lincoln, because it was such a travesty and embarrassment to this country to fight for quote unquote freedom and have slaves being sold in the D.C. area, in Washington, D.C., in view of the capital, that they basically outlawed the sale of slavery. The slave owners demanded since their property was being quote unquote seized, they demanded that the federal government pay them, which the federal government did. And there's documentation, there's bills of sale, all that stuff exists today. So reparations were paid for to the slave holders. But I might add, not a single slave received 1 penny for his or her services under those slave owners. So, if we're going to talk about balancing this, let's start with the true balancing, is true cost and balance.
Every now and then it sort of comes up when we start talking about labor in this country and the history of labor in this country. I remember not too long ago, before the pandemic, when the arguments about the $15 an hour campaigns around the country, and well, first of all, there are people on the right that forever have been talking about, we shouldn't have a minimum wage in this country, that when the $15 an hour campaigns were going on, everybody from small businesses, restaurants, even corporate people, companies were complaining about that it was going to hurt them. Because if $15 today, it'll be $25 tomorrow. So that's a good idea. And I just, as I'm reading this book and as I'm reading the Marrow tradition, I got to keep coming back to this idea that even people who are considered laborers in this country, who are sometimes union members in this country, have this view of labor that, particularly as we've have seen a lot of white blue collar people go over to the Republican side and are one of the first people to complain about labor and cost of labor, and yet what they really mean, they're talking about other people other than themselves. And I just don't understand, when did we as a country, and I'm not just talking about enslaved people, now I'm talking about the people working those textile mills in the North, that we had this view of labor as, we're going to pay them as little as possible so we can get maximum profits. And that labor, of course, has had its history with unions and fight back and stuff like that. But I just detect an acquiescence of like, I guess I could go get another job somewhere else. Now, of course, that's becoming more and more that people, because of the pandemic, are fighting back a little bit more. But there's a lot of people who are just very satisfied with getting their money.
Well, you have to look at the history of the labor in this country, labor unions, particularly. Labor unions put up barriers, particularly for people of color. And most of your labor, particularly construction labor unions, and it holds true today, plumbing, your higher, quote unquote, higher skilled labor unions have very few people of color in those union positions. It's a barrier. And in the sense that it's kept out those, it has allowed them to protect their wages. When you hear people often talk about minimum wage, what they're really saying is that they want to keep those wages as low as possible because they have people that will work for them at those wages. And when you're working at those wages, if you get sick, what do? You run to the emergency. When you run to the emergency, who pays for that? the taxpayer. So what has happened in all of that stuff is that the cost of the welfare is passed on to taxpayers. Companies are escaping that. When they talk about
including food stamps.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. When they're talking about not raising the minimum wage, what they're really saying is we want you to subsidize our companies, because that's what's happening. That's why cost of hospitals have gone up. That's why we're people who get those food stamps. They're often people that are working. They are the working poor. And what has exacerbated all of that, of course, now is the fact that affordable housing doesn't exist. And we can go even further back to things like when we turned out people from mental institutions and put them on the street. States used to pay for that. I mean, take our state of California. We had Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan emptied out those. What happened after that is you had those people on the street living in tents, living under underpasses. Again, whose quality of life does that impact? It doesn't impact those who are living in gated communities, nor does it impact those who are living in the suburbs, by and large. It impacts those who are living close to those people. So it impacts your quality of life. You're the one that's subsidizing the cost for those lobbying groups in those industries. So that my problem is that when you talk about minimum wage, let's bear that burden fairly. Yeah. Don't put it on my back as a taxpayer.
And I as I'm reading the sugar thing, let me read a couple of lines here that just, I try to, as I'm reading this book and reading Chestnut's book, is I try to think to myself, like, what were they thinking? I mean, it's easy for us in 2022 to but there had to be a philosophical and ideology that just in their minds justified all the things that they did. Or really think that this was the way it was. So, like, for instance, although England first established trading posts for acquiring gold and ivory along a span of 1,000 coastal Atlantic miles from present-day Morocco to South Africa, by 1672, King Charles II had conferred a monopoly on the Royal African Company, specifically for the slave trade. The company used military personnel, this is organization, military personnel, government agents, and private investment capital garnered by selling stock to merchants to build the single most successful transatlantic slave trading institution in history. And what jumped out at me was, besides the idea that you're using military personnel, private investment capital garnered by selling stocks to merchants.
Yeah. Well, come on. It's like, why should that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't surprise me. It's like, it's again an example. It's just like we sell stock today. If I want to finance my company, I do it either in the private market or I do it on the public markets. But I'm selling an interest in my company, and the fact that there were people. Yes, we went here without African lives as the human raw materials in the making of sugar, along with other wealth-producing plantation commodities, tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton. The distribution of Atlantic peoples and the worth of the world would likely be very different today.
Of course it would be. Well, again, it's capitalism, and slavery was capitalism on steroids. Slavery existed before, but nothing came to the same level it did with this. This was industrialized capital, industrialized slavery. And you're asking what were people thinking about when they did? Their thoughts were on, these were not people. Those individuals going in the hulls of those ships were their commodity. They were not human beings. They had been taught that. They used the Bible to reinforce their thinking. This was simply cattle, chattel. They were not people. They're not humans. Didn't have to be recognized as such. And we can fast forward to today. Something very similar is happening. It's like, it's not far to think about investing in those companies to investing in prisons on the stock market. Mass incarceration is, in many respects, it's a through line from what happened in Jim Crow to today. When you destroy neighborhoods, which has been done, when you roll your freeways through them, when you take the males, the boys and the men out of those communities, and then you take them, and again, I've been harping on this before, you take them from communities they live in to taking them to rural, small white towns and boost their economy while you devastate the economy of those communities of color. What is that? And it's the investors in Wall Street who are investing in those private prisons. Excuse me, how different is that from what you just read?
Yeah, I was thinking again. I've got to keep looking at the comparisons between the low wage, no wage economy of this time, the 16, 17, 1800s, to the reality of today, and thinking about how many people get, you hear the stories all the time about wage theft.
Mm-hmm.
You hear the stories about, I remember when I first came to LA, one of the many jobs that I held was as an airport shuttle driver. And I remember a few years after I had quit, and I suddenly get this letter in the mail along with a check saying that, of course, before the internet, saying that I was being compensated for a 2-week training period
Mm-hmm.
that I had taken, that someone had sued, or I think it was a class action that I didn't even know was going on, because I never realized it. I guess I just didn't pay attention to the fact that we were not paid for that period.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, you're just lucky to have a job.
Yeah.
So you're not even thinking, well,
Right.
This is training. So you don't equate that, yeah, but
it's your time has a value.
it's your time,
Yeah.
and your time is valuable, but it doesn't have value. So they figure, we'll just call it training, on the job, training, and then they'll be lucky to have a job. And of course, I'm sure it's changed. Yeah, right. But it was ridiculous the way you were paid. You were responsible mm-hmm. for your gas. Mm-hmm. Yes, you could get reimbursed, but sometimes that reimbursement would take forever.
And they're using your money they're using your money and collecting
exactly.
interest while you're waiting for your reimbursement.
Right,
I know that.
Right.
I know that routine.
Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's this. Again, I can't help but think to myself this through line where under our system, not that it doesn't happen in other countries,
mm-hmm.
but under our system, this idea that human beings who provide the labor that makes you rich, mm-hmm. and sometimes like really excessively rich, that you don't have benefits for people, that you don't have, that you create these factories where people oh man, I mean, we've all had these jobs where, what were we thinking working in those jobs?
Mhm.
You
But
know,
capitalism incentivizes exploitation. I'm not saying there's not exploitation in other economic systems, but capitalism primarily incentivizes exploitation. And before we had child labor laws, it was a wide open field. A child could work, untold number of hours. And it's about exploitation. It's simple. Slavery existed under capitalism in the form it took because of exploitation. We took land from indigenous people. And again, that's what they were incentivized to do that because of capitalism. And I want to also, because there'll probably be people listening to say, you're a beneficiary of capitalism. And I will acknowledge that. I mean, and within the system of capitalism, I've probably done well. But that does not mean that this system has not been exploited. And that does not mean that within the system, that its past sins outweigh what its future benefits or present modern day benefits are. And it does not mean that the vast majority of people under the system, particularly if there are people of color, benefited from it.
I'm always amazed at that argument. There's a way of looking at a relationship between an employer and an employee. And that is to look at them and go, if you look at them as equals, that in return for my services,
right,
my skills, you're going to pay me a certain amount of money, provide me with the benefits that I want. It's part of the negotiating process. I think about, there's a lot of industries where people who are particularly moving up the ladder, I'm talking about people who are VPs and senior VPs. And I mean, they're not being treated the same way as an hourly worker.
No.
Or even a person who's paid on an annual basis. There's negotiations. There's, this is what I believe I'm worth. This is what the market says I'm worth. And I'm going to demand a certain amount of money. Now, people have walked away from those negotiations because, well, look at athletes. Athletes do it all the time.
But you have to have leverage. You have to have leverage.
But my point I'm trying to make is the leverage that comes with, in those unions where there is power, in those unions that do not try to keep out people, but who really do believe in the rights of workers, all workers, there's power there. And unfortunately, part of it is the fault of many unions who have a bad reputation because they've exploited their members. But the reality is that we all know corporations leverage because not only do they have the power of their employment, but because they have lobbyists. Yes. But because they're part of associations, they write legislation to their advantage, tax laws to their advantage.
Sure.
And workers on this side don't. So there's always been this uneven, and yes, even more so with enslaved people.
Yeah.
And it always kills me when I read about things like, in this book, for instance, Samaro, but even other books that I've read, where white enslavers couldn't understand why their enslaved people would rise up against them. I mean, I provide you food. I provide you with clothing. Don't I provide you with shelter? Don't I provide you with...
Don't you think some of that was rationalization? It's hard for me to believe that a slave owner who has worked his slave to death and can beat them, has total control, cannot understand why that person.
Because they don't see them as people.
Well, yeah, but they were scared. The other thing is, to keep in mind the other part of this. The other part of this was when there were slave revolts, and there were many. Yes. They came out, and first of all, fear factor made them go into a frenzy. You don't go into a frenzy when you've got an animal. Animals don't organize and go after you in that regard. What they feared more than anything else, I think, was the fact that one, slave rebellions, and two, they feared that slaves might get allies with others. I mean, that is part of what this country was built on. The separation of groups, which is why they kept the quote unquote the African slaves, enslaved people at the bottom. So you can always say, you know what, no matter how bad it is for you, no matter how bad we exploit you,
right,
you're not down there. And enough people, it's human nature, human nature for people to do that. I mean, to believe that someone else is down there. I don't want to be down there, so I'm going to step on them.
I don't remember which chapter it is, but it may be the fear chapter, which is coming up soon, where when the enslaved people in Haiti revolted and took over the country. Mm-hmm. I mean, when news of that reached the colonies, reached particularly the southern states in Florida and Louisiana, I mean, they just went nuts.
Our police force, our police forces today.
Yes.
Many of them have their roots, and many of the actual police forces grew out of that, the slave patrols, because they were frightened. They were frightened to death. And in some of those places, the African enslaved people outnumbered them.
Yes.
And so they had to come down with the harshest kind of punitive treatment they possibly could in order to keep those people who they didn't acknowledge as people, those subhumans, in line. I mean, this explains a lot in this country to modern day policing. If you want to see where it has its roots, and you go back to those slave times.
Let me read one more paragraph that it's just, I mean, I got to keep coming back to capitalism. This is on page 77. The ferocious appetite for wealth creation and the unyielding desire for sugar combined to create the foundation of a modern world. Mm-hmm. From the first time Royal African Company slavers set sail for North America, through the years of the American Revolution, until the abolition of the international slave trade in 1808, roughly 3 million souls, many of them forever branded with the company's initials, RAC, on their bodies, would be forcibly removed from their homes, their kin, and their way of life. The majority of them to feed demand for a sweetener. Countless fortunes were made. In Liverpool, the Martins Bank building opened in 1932, and the former home of Barclays memorialized the role of banks in financing the trade with a relief sculpture of 2 African boys fettered about the neck and ankles and holding bags of money.
Says it all, doesn't it? It says it all about capitalism. Do you know the movie Dune? Well, actually, more appropriately to talk about Dune, the book written by Frank Herbert. Much of that, particularly to talk about spice and how addicted it was to the rest of the Federation. Much of that's taken from sugar. You substitute spice and read that as the history of slave trade. It is about the slave trade. I mean, I don't know how much Frank Herbert had in mind when he was writing that, but I'm sure that was part of it. And I know when I read it as a kid, I certainly did. I certainly transposed the sugar.
It's really hard to read some of these passages because you have to continuously tell yourself that this is not just words on a page. They're talking about real people
Mhm.
and a history of this country that many people would like to just forget about.
Yeah.
This is talking about the Middle Passage, which of course is the voyage from Africa to the Western world, Western Hemisphere. On the Middle Passage, mortality rates ranged from 5 to 20%, lowering as the centuries pass. Africans died most often from diseases, including scurvy and acute vitamin C deficiency, smallpox, pneumonia, and tapeworms. The flux or dysentery, the most common cause of death, produces own slow torture of blood-soaked diarrhea and incessant vomiting triggered by a bacterial infection from contaminated food or water. By the time captives became enslaved on the other side, they had experienced layered cycles of violence, deprivation, and death.
No, I just said, think about the psychological damage, the trauma. That trauma has been passed down to many of those people today. And I say those, I mean that to include myself in it. But we're talking about generations. And then when you have those who say it didn't happen, or that I should not be shamed with this, it continues this traumatic, experience, this collective amnesia we have in this country.
I think that one of the, I wrote something from one of my classes where I said that this country is in such denial of everything that doesn't support this narrative that we are exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
We're exceptional, all right, and I mean exceptional in barbarism. Whether it's enslaved Africans, enslaved Native people, whether it's I'm not making a comparison of one being worse than the other. I'm not going to get into that debate. We all know what's worse. But even things like, and I've told this story before, my father coming to this country from Puerto Rico, which, by the way, just to tell, just in case people don't know, Puerto Ricans have been American citizens since 1917. Went to New York, and I don't know if someone told him or he just figured it out himself. Never admit that you're Puerto Rican. This is back in this late 1940s.
Yeah.
If anybody asks, tell them you're from Spain.
Yeah, of course.
And I remember it so vividly. I mean, he told me this story. I must have been, I don't know, maybe 8 years old, 10 years old, but it was young. And I think about how low must you feel? And by the way, he went to work at a company where there were Italians and Irish.
Yeah.
Think about that irony for a second. If you know anything about the history of immigration in this country, that you can't tell them that you're an American citizen.
True.
No, you have to tell them you're an immigrant.
Yeah.
From Europe. Because that would be okay.
There's some poetic irony in that.
Yeah, and this idea that this, again, going back to this idea of how ethnicity, how race has been used as this, I'm talking about under the umbrella of capitalism, to pit people against each other, to exploit people, as an excuse to exploit people. That happens to this day.
It sure does. It's interesting you raise Puerto Rico, and because it brings up a fourth leg of this chair or stool, and that's imperialism.
Right.
we haven't talked about imperialism, and this book, at least so far that I've read, has not touched upon imperialism. But
Right.
that deserves a special mention when you talk about, our role and what we've done in this country, not just in, particularly, let me rephrase that, particularly in this hemisphere, and not to mention in Asia, Southeast Asia. We have not only have we had imperialism, we have exported our racism to those countries. Puerto Rico is one of them, which you can see it in. You can see it in Cuba. You can see it in the Philippines.
You can see it in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for that matter, you can see it in Haiti. I mean,
right.
We've exported our brand of racism to those particular countries. So that's a part of this question. That's a part of the story.
Yeah, we should probably take a show and just deal with this, because I just I think who was it? There was a comedian, may have been Trevor Noah, but there was another comedian I remember, English comedian, Black, who talked about England, particularly during the Brexit issue. About too many foreigners in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, they always kept pointing toward oh, no, we're talking about the Poles, and the Hungarians. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The point the comedian kept making was, well, first of all, we didn't ask to come here.
Right.
You brought us here. You went all the way to England, to India, to many parts of Africa, to the United States, to the Middle East, to Hong Kong, to China. They didn't invite you.
No.
And and now you're complaining because the best food in England is Indian food. You should be so lucky.
That's funny. Actually, quite funny. Yeah.
And the same thing in this country.
Yeah.
We have, of course, a very terrible history of imperialism in South America and the Caribbean.
Yes, we do. Oh, we do.
And then you wonder why there's so many South Americans, Mexicans, worse, Central America. One of the best examples of where we supported
oh God, I know.
The dictators and the overthrow of governments in Guatemala, and I mean, where else? With Nicaragua. Come on.
Chile, Argentina supported. We
Yes.
supported the most brutal dictators, some of the most brutal dictators certainly in the past century. And we not only supported it, we encouraged it.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, it's why are we surprised that people look at us as a country and wonder, have we really changed?
Well, we have changed. I mean, I will give us.
Well, we have changed, but I also know that we haven't changed.
Yeah, I mean,
in the sense of corporations who, for years, things that, the exploitation of people, particularly in markets like Bangladesh, Vietnam, even, whether it was in Cambodia or even in India and Pakistan. I think Bangladesh stands out as, when news reaches us that a building has collapsed or a fire has consumed a building that was making sneakers, I think they mostly made clothing that made its way to the United States.
Let me also, you have to unpack that a little bit in this regard. Places like Bangladesh, Vietnam, we would, if you talk about, let's view that through the lens of these people getting harmed irreparably, that's correct. But if you pull back and look at the bigger picture, you look at what happened when American corporations who were employing Americans to do those jobs, they're paying them, maybe it's lousy working condition, but they were paying those people, they were being employed. They shipped those jobs, and not just the textile jobs, they shipped manufacturing jobs to cheaper labor countries. And many of those jobs they shipped were whites. They were working class white people. There were some, of course, black people also lost jobs, but the predominant number of those factory jobs were white people who were able to make a living, support their families in those communities. They shipped them to Southeast Asia specifically. So what you've got is a hollowing out of a working class. That gets lost in the conversation. Now, in regards to Southeast Asia, like Bangladesh and Vietnam and a number of others there, it also has to be acknowledged that for some of those people, those jobs were clearly a step up from what they all were doing before, which is usually working in a on a small farm,
right,
barely sustaining themselves, or in the case of maybe the Philippines, where they were being exploited on farms and in factories. So they were being pulled out of that abject poverty. Wasn't the greatest jobs, agreed, but if you look at it from that respect, you have to look at it and say, who was benefiting? Now, of course, the people at the top, the manufacturers, the corporations, the top executives benefiting vastly. But who took the biggest hits were the working class in this country. And that, again, is not discussed.
Thank you very much for joining us on the 1619 Project. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, man.